and so, oh, there we go. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our fall webinar, Multilingual Perspectives on Translanguaging, co-sponsored by the Second Language Research SIG and Bilingual Education Research SIG. I'm Liv Davila, Chair of the Second Language Research SIG, and it's a pleasure to have you with us as I see people populating our list. Let's see here. There we go. Oh, went too fast. Apologies. I'd first like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Illinois is on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their survival and identity. And again, thank you all for being here. The program for this webinar, and my slides keep advancing without my asking them to, is the following. So welcome again from me. So glad to have you all here. So glad to be able to introduce our panelists and to hear their words of wisdom. The program will follow the following order, but for roughly an hour, beginning with Jeff MacSwan and Peter Auer, Teresa McCarty and Sheilah Nicholas, Rakesh Bhatt, and finishing with Stephen May. After 1 hour, and I'm not using specific times because I know we're coming in from different time zones, but after 1 hour, we'll move to the question and answer portion of the webinar, followed by concluding remarks. Before going any further, I'd like to give a special thanks to the following, you all, for your interest and engagement. We have roughly 485 registrants, which is pretty amazing, which shows level of interest in these topics to be discussed here. I'd also like to thank co-moderators Cristina Di Nicolo, Laura Haman-Ortiz, and Marisol Maso for their help with preparing for and facilitating this webinar, and also our person without whom we could do, without whose assistance this wouldn't be possible, and that is Pedro Correa at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. If you're interested in becoming involved in either the second language research or the bilingual education research SIGs, you see our respective email addresses there at the bottom. And on the right is an image picture taken at our 2022 annual meeting, AERA annual meeting, which took place in San Diego and at Chicano Park, where we had a co-sponsored event at this park, and really lovely time together. So without further ado, I will stop share and hand over to Dr. Jeff MacSwan to begin his presentation.
Thanks so much, Liv. On behalf of all the panelists, we really appreciate the invitation from the Second Language Research SIG and the Bilingual Education Research SIG. And we're really excited to have this opportunity to share the work. I am going to share my screen. Okay, am I correct that you can all see my slides, Liv? You guys seeing that?
Yeah, correct.
Wonderful, thank you. So what I want to do is share a little bit about the book and try to spark interest among the audience and the listeners in pursuing the work in more detail, sort of, on your own. We could only really give you some highlights and a taste. And so I'm going to use my time to talk sort of broadly about the book and hit in a more focused way a couple of themes from my introductory chapter of the book. So in a nutshell, the book critically assesses what we are characterizing as a recent proposal within translanguaging theory. And we're using the name deconstructivism for that particular position, which is the view that discrete or named languages do not exist. And as I'll show, this idea emerges out of postmodernist and post-structuralist positioning within the language planning and policy literature, and from there becomes an influence only about 10 years ago on translanguaging theory. And so the authors, the contributors to the volume support a multilingual perspective, which affirms the pedagogical and conceptual aims of translanguaging, but we reject these newer developments embodied in deconstructivism. This is just a quick screenshot of the table of contents of the book. I'm going to come back to the various sections in a little bit more detail toward the end of my talk. These are the panelists who Leave has already named. So we're very excited to have this internationally situated and diverse in multiple ways group of panelists to share their expertise. These are really, excellent scholars who are at the top of their field. So it's really great and an honor for me to share the stage with them. I'm just going to sort of briefly introduce them so you know a little bit about them. I won't read the whole slide because it would take up too much time. But Peter Auer is coming to us from Freiburg, Germany. He is professor of German linguistics, and Peter's work in sociolinguistics is at the intersection of code switching and conversational analysis. He has done truly groundbreaking and foundational work on code switching, so he'll be sharing his perspective with us today. And he has written a chapter in the book as well, as have all of the panelists. Sheilah Nicholas is a member of the Hopi, or the Hopi people, and she is professor at the University of Arizona, where she specializes on the study of indigenous languages and indigenous language revitalization. She will be co-presenting today with Teresa L. McCarty, who is an educational anthropologist and applied linguist. Terry is a distinguished professor in the G.F. Neller Chair in Education and Anthropology at UCLA. And she has a very long history of influential work in language policy, language revitalization, and many other areas. Rakesh Bhatt is a very distinguished sociolinguist whose work focuses on multilingualism, code switching, language ideology, and world Englishes. And he is a faculty member, professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And Stephen May is professor of education at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. He is an international authority on language rights, language policy, bilingualism, and bilingual education. He has written a lot of very important and influential books, and we're very honored to have him with us as well. I'm going to walk through and try to make these two key points, which are made in a detailed way in the introductory chapter. So a very important point is that translanguaging at the theoretical level has evolved. So there's early translanguaging theory, which differs from late translanguaging theory. Early translanguaging had a multilingual perspective and lived in harmony with research on multilingualism, but then late translanguaging theory adopted this deconstructivist orientation and is relatively new. And so our goal is to push back on deconstructivism and advocate for a multilingual perspective. Another point I hope to make today is that late translanguaging theory, being rooted in postmodernist and post-structuralist scholarship into language planning and policy literature, is actually a disfavored approach in the fight for social justice. And so I'm going to make the case that Freirean critical consciousness actually is a very different perspective in critical theory and a better perspective that we should take up in the fight for social justice, and would urge us to move away from this postmodernist, post-structuralist deconstructivism point of view. So we can think of translanguaging as kind of having these three different components, at least. A conceptual framework, which is very similar to the work that Francois Grosjean did around holistic bilingualism. It's the key idea there is that a bilingual is not the sum of two monolinguals, but has a unique language learning experience. So we don't want to compare bilinguals to monolinguals in that sense. It's also a pedagogical research program asking whether language mixing can effectively facilitate language teaching and learning and for bilingual students in classrooms. And there's a lot of work on that, which we've all read and appreciated. And then the focus of the book really primarily is on the area of language theory and looking, as I say, critically at this deconstructivist perspective that has emerged more recently in the translanguaging literature. So early translanguaging theory, really in terms of the revitalization of this idea in contemporary times, goes back to Ofelia Garcia's excellent 2009 book, where we see translanguaging very peacefully at home with a broad range of topics in bilingualism. So here we see the definition of translanguaging as multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual worlds. Translanguaging goes beyond what has been called code switching, although it includes it as well as other kinds of bilingual language use and language contact. So in this original introduction of translanguaging, or reintroduction, if you want to think of it that way, translanguaging is partnered with an extensive discussion of code switching, borrowing, and other dimensions of language contact, both as sociolinguistic concepts and as pedagogical tools. And there is no reluctance or critique of any of these ideas in that original presentation. Here's an example of Ofelia Garcia commenting on code switching in a very artful way. Code switching often occurs spontaneously among bilingual speakers in communication with others who share their languages. Far from being a sign of inadequacy or sloppy language usage or lack of knowledge, it has been shown that code switching is a sophisticated linguistic skill and a characteristic of the speech of fluent bilinguals. So then we see the emergence of this strand within this deconstructivist strand in the postmodernist orientation within language planning and policy, primarily through the work of Alistair Pennycook. A postmodern approach to language policy suggests we no longer need to maintain the pernicious myth that languages exist. In McCarty and Pennycook, the view of language we are suggesting here has serious implications for many of the treasured icons of liberal linguistic thought. Not only do the notions of language become highly suspect, but so do many related concepts that are premised on the notion of discrete languages, such as language rights, mother tongues, multilingualism, or code switching. And in fact, a little more broadly, and Pennycook and McCarty would certainly acknowledge this, second language acquisition is not a viable concept within a deconstructivist orientation. Any notion that suggests internal organization or community level organization of languages is suspect or actually denied within the deconstructivist point of view. And so this is picked up as early as Garcia and Lee in 2014, where they reference the rise of post-structuralism in the postmodern era and how that has really shaped their new understanding of language within translanguaging theory. And there are many other examples of this uptake of these ideas in the translanguaging literature. But in fact, these so-called new epistemologies are not very new at all, right? They were very evident in the 1980s. They entered into so Paulo Freire had created critical pedagogy, and the postmodernists, thought they would get involved in that, and they started to pitch a very different critical perspective within that literature. And it was entertained for a while, but very quickly fell out of favor. And so very influential critical theorists like Peter McLaren pushed back against postmodernism as a counterproductive narrative, a counterproductive approach to social justice generally. He says postmodernism has failed to develop alternative democratic social models. A key reason for that, Peter argues, is its sustained intellectual contempt toward what it regards as the Eurocentric Enlightenment project of human progress, equality, justice, rationality, and truth. So the postmodernist epistemological commitment reflects skepticism toward theory, and particularly empirically grounded theory. But the Freirean perspective doesn't take that point of view at all. And as you see in the quote from Freire below there, the 1985 quote, Freire says, for those who undertake cultural action for freedom, science is the indispensable instrument for denouncing the mythos created by the right, and philosophy is the matrix of the proclamation of a new reality. In other words, we should combat the indoctrination of people into accepting what Freire calls a mythified version of reality. We should combat indoctrination with theoretically, empirically well-grounded theories. So for me, and I think for many people, the reason this is such an important topic is it has very dramatic, dire consequences for language policy. So for one thing, a key idea among deconstructivists is the argument that named languages are an expression of colonialism. French, English, Spanish, Portuguese, these are all colonial, historically colonial nations, and their languages colonized many, many people, and that is certainly true. But language naming can also be an act of resistance, an act of decolonization. So when we talk about Black language, when we talk about African American language, Chicano English, Indian English, and in Sheilah and Terry's wonderful chapter in the book on indigenous languages, they too make this point that naming languages becomes an act of decolonization, an act of resistance. So it's important to be able to identify groups who live and exist as a language community, because that is such an important part of their identity. Another important language policy illustration of this concern is in the work of John Baugh and his colleagues around linguistic profiling. Some of you may be aware of his work showing this really tremendous and extremely influential and helpful result that showed that landlords would enact housing discrimination against applicants based on the sound of their voice, because they identified them as speakers of Black English, or they identified them as speakers of Chicano English. Without a concept of a linguistic community, the argument that this was the use of accent as a proxy for race would disappear. So these become incredibly important concepts in the context of language policy. And when we think about bilingualism at the individual level, right, the idea that bilingualism is psychologically real, it also becomes problematic for really basic language policy concepts in our field, like the protection of civil rights of emergent bilinguals whose English language proficiency does not permit them to participate in a meaningful way in English-only instruction, right? This was the foundation of the Lau v. Nichols court decision. If we can't refer to a target community for acquisition of English, if we can't refer to a child's developing proficiency in a second language, then we are no longer able to enact policies to protect children's civil rights. And this very idea of an emergent bilingual, which seeks to express seeks to identify second language learners in a way that emphasizes their knowledge rather than their lack of knowledge, it embodies the idea of individual bilingualism. So all of these are critically important. I know I'm running short on time, so I'm just going to very quickly in 30 seconds run through the book, section by section. We have a wonderful chapter by Vivian Cook, who unfortunately passed away before his chapter could appear, where he looks at multi-competence and translanguaging. We have a chapter by James G, where he explores linguistic diversity in the context of interlanguage variation through his concept of social languages. Part 2 is devoted to code switching, a big topic for scholars and for scholars who are, well, let's say for the debate in translanguaging and traditional ideas in bilingual education and bilingualism research. I write a chapter for this section. Peter Auer and Rakesh Bhatt, co-authoring with Agnes Bologna, have chapters in this section, and Peter and Rakesh will be presenting that work shortly. We have a psycholinguistics section where Fred Genesee looks at evidence for language differentiation in studies of bilingual first language acquisition. We have a neurolinguistics contribution from Rebecca Marks and her colleagues looking at bilingual reading development. Part 4 is about language policy. That's where Sheilah and Terry's chapter appears. And we have a wonderful chapter by Terry Wiley that looks at language minority rights in terms of the rich history of bilingual education. Section 5 is focused on practice. And there we have a chapter by Joanna McCaig and Diane Teddick that is focused on immersion programs for minoritized languages at risk of disappearance. And we have a terrific chapter by Chris Fultis, who looks at language ideologies and bilingual teacher education. And Chris also did the artwork for the book. As many of us know, he's a terrific artist. And then the book concludes with a very thoughtful afterword by Stephen May, who's here on the panel to share with us. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Peter Auer for his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, I have to say, because I'm from Europe, participating from Europe, where it is 9:30 right now. I'm happy to be with you, and thanks to Zoom, this is possible. Now let me just try to share my screen with you. Okay. Okay, this is not exactly what I wanted, but I think it will be better. Now, okay, that should be fine. Okay, well, what I want to do is really in this very short period of time, which I have, give you a short summary of the two main arguments, which I can't move my slides. What is happening here? Okay, now it works. The two main arguments I want to make in my chapter in this wonderful book edited by Jeff. And these two main arguments are the following. The first argument that is, which I want to make is that the opposition between translanguaging on one hand and code switching on the other hand. So the claim that there is an opposition between these two notions and they are really dealing with completely different issues is based on a massive misrepresentation of research on bilingualism, which has accumulated since the 1970s. And I don't think we should accept this kind of misrepresentation. And then the second point I want to make is that one of the central assumptions of the theory of translanguaging, one which Jeff already alluded to, namely the fact that there are no languages, is falsified by the very way in which the bilingual speakers who, for instance, Ophelia Garcia and her colleagues work with and whose behavior they want to describe, present. So let me just go a little bit into these two issues. Just to recapitulate, there are two basic claims made by in the literature on translanguaging. The first claim is that speakers never speak languages, but they rather dispose of a repertoire of forms, and then the linguists and maybe the state authorities, the teachers, and so on, categorize these ways of speaking as belonging to different so-called named languages. So that's one claim. The second claim is that contrary to the speakers themselves, the languaging speakers, research on code switching presupposes that there are clearly separated so-called named languages, and therefore that research on code switching is unable to deal with the fluidity of present-day multilingual speakers. So I don't think that this is the case. Let me just start very quickly with the question of how code switching is presented in this research. And in particular, there are two things in which this portrayal, I think, is really entirely mistaken. One is the claim that code switching relies on the juxtaposition of so-called named languages or official languages. I think this has never been claimed in code switching research, and I've been following this research for decades now, starting with John Gumpertz, who I worked with quite intensively in my early phase when I worked on my PhD thesis. Quite on the contrary, the code switching research has always insisted that speakers can switch between codes that do not have names, not official names at least, that all that is needed for code switching to happen and to occur and to work are two codes that are perceived by the speakers as being different. So, for instance, it has been shown that speakers may switch between a monolingual and a bilingual way of speaking. So certainly not a named language. The second point, the second claim is that code switching relies on clearly delimited standard languages. And again, I think to the best of my knowledge that code switching researchers never claimed this. In fact, many sociolinguists working on code switching have claimed the opposite. And code switching research has shown that code switching often occurs between non-standard varieties definitely, for instance, between dialect and standard varieties. And even more important, maybe, sociolinguistic research has shown that the codes that are switched regularly are not the monolingual standard languages. In fact, it's one of the main findings of code switching research that the very fact of code switching a lot makes these codes, the two languages, diverge from their monolingual counterparts. So they converge to each other and diverge from the monolingual counterparts. So for these reasons and quite a couple of other reasons, it is simply wrong to claim that code switching relies on the named, so-called named standard languages. Now, of course, the most important point behind that is that we should not disregard the very rich tradition of sociolinguistic and anthropological research on bilingual talk, on code switching, and also other forms of bilingual talk, such as mixing between languages. Because if we do so, this really threatens our capacity to analyze appropriately the many forms of language contact which we observe in interaction. So in other words, I think that subsuming everything under the label of translanguaging does not do justice to the varieties of bilingual talk that have been described in the literature. If we want to capture the ways in which speakers select variables from their multilingual repertoires, we should not forget about these sophisticated models that have been developed over the last decades. We need them to do justice to these forms of behavior. Okay, so this is the first part of my paper, arguing that this opposition between code switching on the one hand and translanguaging on the other hand is simply mistaken. But maybe the more important point is the second one I want to make in the chapter, and that is deals with the central assumption of the theory of translanguaging, that there are no languages. And what I want to argue is that this assumption is already falsified by the very way in which the bilingual speakers investigated in this research use their repertoires. So, of course, you know the basic claims made in the translanguaging literature. On the one hand, there are the named languages that cannot even be defined in grammatical terms. They are inventions of linguists, and there is ultimately no good reason to continue to posit their existence. So very strong claims. On the other hand, there are the billions of individual linguistic competences of the speakers the world over, and they are the real languages. They have a grammar, but not the social facts called languages. So on the one hand, we have the mental facts or cognitive facts. On the other hand, we have just social constructs with implications that social constructs are not really true. And of course, one thing is the good guys and the other thing is the bad guys. Now, is this really true? Well, I would argue that languages are, of course, social constructs. What else could they be? Of course, there are social facts, and as such, they are socially constructed. But nevertheless, these social facts are very real for most speakers, and particularly the ones investigated in the translanguaging literature, particularly in Europe and the United States. And the second point is they are not only construed by the language authorities, by the linguists, by the state institutions, by the schools and so on, but they are constructed by the multilingual speakers themselves through the way in which they use their languages. Let me just give you one small example, one of the examples I took from Garcia's work, in order to show you what I mean by that. It's one of her examples taken from a school context, a bilingual school context. We have kids who speak partly English, partly Spanish, partly a mixture of both. And this is one of these little extracts. There is a boy who speaks Spanish in the beginning of this little sequence, saying, "Está lloviendo mucho." And then he says in English, look, it's washing. And there's washing afuera. And then another girl comes in and she asks him, está lloviendo? And then she turns to the ethnographer and says, in English, he says raining. He speaks Spanish, only Spanish. And then she turns again to Adolfo and says raining. So what is happening here? I think it's very clear that languages are an issue here for the kids. They orient to the fact that they are dealing with different languages. Very clearly, of course, in the case of the girl, she names the language. She talks of Spanish being used here by the boy. But at a more, let's say, sophisticated level, we can note that the entire conversational exchange does not make any sense unless we see Gabriela's way of behaving, her code switching, as I would call it, as a functional switching. So she chooses between different addressees by using one or the other language. And this only works because she uses the opposition between these two codes, English and Spanish, as a resource for meaning making. So code switching only makes sense because the speakers assume that there is a difference between these codes. And if you look into more detail into the extract, you will realize that Gabriela establishes herself as a translator or an interpreter between Adolfo, the boy, and the ethnographer. And she construes both of them as monolinguals. Adolfo as a monolingual Spanish-speaking person and the ethnographer as an English-speaking person. And in line with this, she interprets, she takes on the role of an interpreter between the two. Later on, she takes on the role of a language teacher who tells Adolfo the correct English expression. So all these roles, the role of the interpreter, the lay interpreter in discourse, and also the lay language teacher, of course, presuppose the existence of two languages. So in sum, what you can see here and in many other examples presented in this work on translanguaging is very clear code switching and interpreting, by which Gabriela is what I call, following the ethnomethodological tradition, being bilingual. And by doing so, she constructs Spanish and English as separate codes which can be opposed to each other and therefore as social facts. So the point here is that these two languages are not just opposed on Gabriela and the boy in this extract, they are used by them, and by using them, they also do being bilingual and doing code switching. Okay, so much for a very short summary of what I wanted to say. And I think I hand over to, I don't know, to Jeff first of all.
Yes, I think now we're going to hear from Sheilah Nicholas and Teresa McCarty. And I believe Leave is going to manage the slides for them.
So make sure you can see the slides.
I'm really sorry, but
Sheilah, you're muted.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
There's a machine going on. I'll do my best here. Good day to everyone from Tarndania, Adelaide, Australia. Go back to the other slide, please. It's the homelands of the Kaurna people of South Australia, where I've been attending the week-long 2022 World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education.
Next slide, please. Greetings, and we thank Jeff MacSwan for inviting us to be part of this panel. I'm speaking from the homelands of the Tongva, sovereign peoples of the lands and waters renamed in Spanish and English, Los Angeles and the South Channel Islands. Next slide.
Next slide. WIPSE, the World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education, is the largest and most diverse education forum bringing together Indigenous peoples from across the globe to celebrate our rich cultures and knowledges, and to share our distinct ways of becoming, our identity, knowing, epistemological origins, and being, moral existence, to effect culturally and linguistically grounded education as language education rights. This reflects a shared aspect of Indigenous ontology and epistemology, relationality, which we propose as a paradigm for language rights. This paradigm embraces the full use of our linguistic repertoires as speakers, relearners of our ancestral languages, speakers of dominant languages, and as majority rather than minority or marginalized bi and multilinguals.
Next slide.
Next slide. Outside of such Indigenous spaces as WIPSI, coloniality remains an ongoing legacy and our daily reality. Yet within such neo-colonial contexts and against recurring forms of erasure as proposed by deconstructivism, Indigenous language reclamation efforts continue to take shape and persist. Like this Indigenous Global Forum, our chapter arose from a similar gathering in 2019 of Indigenous educators representing diverse tribal nations from the US with shared concerns of retaining their ancestral languages, emblematic of the unique contexts in which Indigenous language issues are embedded. At the 2019 gathering, individual and communal self-empowerment through ancestral language reclamation emerged as the prime message. For Native educators and activists, language reclamation is a calling that is holistic, relational, interrelational, and interdependent with Indigenous philosophies, beliefs, and ways of life.
Next slide. The title of our chapter in this presentation derives from the words of an Oneida elder at the 2019 gathering, Gerald Hill, who urged participants to, quote, think in a different way about Indigenous language education and reclamation. So building on Indigenous experiences with language reclamation, we propose a relational approach to language rights that foregrounds Indigenous practices of mutuality and responsibility to generations past, present, and future. Next slide. This is also an explicitly power-conscious approach that reckons directly with settler colonialism. As Gikuyu literary scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes, unnaming and renaming are prime tactics of colonial erasure intended to break down relationships forged over generations between people, place, language, and culture. Schools are at the epicenter of the intended erasure. We're also informed by a question posed by Comanche linguistic anthropologist Barbara Meek that in any language-related analysis, we need to ask who benefits and who loses from understanding languages the way we do, and what is at stake for whom. So while we have an understanding of language systems as fluid and dynamic, not as bounded entities, this does not preclude the significance of specific named languages in Indigenous histories of experience and contemporary self-determined language and education efforts. Next slide. So in our chapter, we explore these ideas and a relational paradigm through three cases. Hopi, and I think we need to go back. I think we need to go back if we can leave. There's another, there we go. Okay, thank you. Hopi, Miamia, and Mohawk, the other direction. One more, backward. Thank you. The most promising efforts, we argue, emerged from grassroots anti-colonial language education movements, what Miamia linguist Wesley Leonard calls collaborative language work. And now we can move.
Not yet.
Okay.
Stay there. Sorry.
Okay.
So in presenting these cases, we raise the volume on Indigenous community voices, asking the audience and readers with ears to hear this testimony so that we may learn, quote, to think in a different way, unquote, about language rights. Now, the next slide. In the context of this webinar's focus on multilingualism and speaking from a personal journey to reclaim my speaker user ability of Hopi Lavai, my ancestral language, today it is a journey that I describe as a previous exile and the return from exile through language reclamation, so that going into our language is the process to begin this remembering of restoring the memories of the deeply felt sense of physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual self-knowledge base on generations of accumulated interactions and experiences with place. Next slide. Language names and naming are critical connectors to lands, waters, people, and territories. This is a mountain range located in our Aboriginal homelands in north central Arizona, but today is known as the San Francisco Peaks. Named for St. Francis of Assisi in 1629 by Franciscan friars conducting missionary work with natives in the area. This renaming is an erasure of the meaning of this significant cultural landmark that occurred during the turbulent history of Spanish occupation of Hopi homelands from 1540 to 1679, and later followed by Euro-American colonization. Today, we have renormalized its original name, Nubatigyaovi, meaning both the place of the stacked snow and the awesome place, which refers to this landmark as the southwest cardinal direction home of the Katsinam, the cloud people, who are the spirit beings of those who have passed on. We continue to look toward this mountain range in anticipation of the coming of the spirit beings in many forms representing all of the life forces. Importantly, this knowledge, which is fundamental to Hopi identity, is conveyed by and exists only in Hopi Lavai, the Hopi language. This renaming and erasure, though, conversely positions this knowledge and by extension, this identity to be distorted and erased through renaming in the languages of Spanish and English. Next slide.
We also look at the case of Miamia, Miami, where the language was recovered entirely from written text. There were no first language speakers until community-based language reclamation began in the 1990s. And this was a result of forced relocation and diasporization, as the maps here suggest. Daryl Baldwin, who's a leader in the Miamia movement, uses the metaphor of a colonized, weed-filled garden that leads to many losses that we live with today. We must be conscious gardeners if we're going to have a community harvest, he says. Next slide.
It's been now 30 years of tending the metaphoric Miamia language garden, and there are growing numbers of Miamia second and first language speakers. But more than linguistic fluency, the Miamia case points to the relational qualities inherent in a larger project of community rebuilding and named sociohistorical and contemporary realities.
Next slide. Our third case is Mohawk, the indigenous name for which refers to flint deposits for tool making. in Mohawk homelands known in English as upstate New York. Next slide.
There's a
There.
long-term,
Go ahead, Sheilah.
there, a long-term resistance and resurgent movement led to the creation of the Akwesasne Freedom School, an all Mohawk immersion school run by parents and community members. Quote, "We're nothing like Western education," unquote, says Alvera Sargent, a leader in the movement. Quote again, "Everything is done in the Mohawk language. We're just not like state-sponsored schools at all. The school has been a center for grassroots nation building through the Mohawk language."
Next slide.
Slide.
So in closing, we return to Barbara Meek's compelling question of who benefits and who loses from understanding languages the way we do. In Indigenous settings, the stakes in these understandings are steeped in ongoing coloniality. Unsettling the colonial footprint requires that we reconceptualize language rights in a different way, centering distinct community histories, relationships, and aspirations alongside an anti-colonial critique.
Because Indigenous communities are minoritized and often diasporized, as in the case of Miamia, language reclamation requires carving out Indigenous language-only spaces and being ever vigilant to re-invasion and erasure by colonial language practices and policies. Terry, did
Okay, I can take the last part. So we urge serious attention to Indigenous understandings of languages and language rights, and to the question of who benefits and what's at stake in our scholarly understandings and representations of rights to languages. Our hope is that an Indigenous relational paradigm will deepen and widen language rights discourses while offering support to the vital and growing Indigenous language reclamation movement. Thank you.
Esquale?
Thank you so much for really thought-provoking and beautiful presentation. Our next speaker is Rakesh Bhatt, and I will share your slides.
I could do that. I think because there are little things that I need to do. So let me just share the screen. Okay. Can everybody see the screen? Okay. All right. So thank you, Jeff, and everybody else. And I think that I should start by paying homage to all people who are here, especially the gurus here. I actually grew up learning about bilingualism from works of Peter Auer, and it's totally a pleasure to be actually on the same panel with him. And of course, there are many other luminaries here. Thank you. I will just try to stick to 12 minutes. So the question that, of course, needs to be asked is why translanguage when you can, in fact, code switch? I guess if the field has to make progress and if we have to advance knowledge, then we have to at least ask two questions. One, it is, of course, that what new generalizable knowledge is offered by this theoretical construct, translanguaging. And then, of course, what new empirical coverage is offered by this theoretical construct, translanguaging. And of course, it's skin, polylanguaging, and so on and so forth. So my goal really, which is rather modest, is to present arguments to reclaim the theoretical status of code switching, which I understand, and most of us understand. And I think if you look at the history, and I'm glad that Peter pointed out to John Gumpers, who got the idea of this multilingual context of language use while he was in India in the early 60s. In fact, late 50s, the day before even I was born, he just realized how Indians manage their multilingualism and talking about the different codes that are switched. And these are not named languages. And if you look at his earlier work in the 60s, 62, or, you see that he's talking about two dialects. One is a very rural dialect of Punjabi, and then the standard, that is spoken in other places. So the switching that goes on, and he looks at certain linguistic diacritics of these differences. So there were these clear grammatical differences, and he had some aide, some TA, I believe, who was transcribing, and he shows what the phonological and syntactic correlates of the differences between these two varieties were. So it's not really, as Peter was also talking about, named languages, yada, yada. No, these were essentially codes that were understood by the speakers as belonging to, as it were, different archives. And what I think we got to start is to sort of reinstall the idea that code switching is an active agentive socio-cognitive mechanism that is employed by social actors to produce and interpret the meaning potential. This is going back to Michael Halliday's work of linguistic symbols, acts, utterances, features, and the multilingual universe we inhabit. So that is where what I would like to do is to show, at least briefly in this 12 minutes, it's going to be severely modest presentation of the ideas, but the paper that I wrote with Agnes Bologna, I actually details with the empirical rigor that is needed to show, in fact, that code switching is just fine. We were doing just fine before Translanguaging got it. So what happened here? Okay, so what is the construct? Is translanguaging, this has been defined as that replaces code switching as a descriptive analytical term to capture the complexity of bilingual behavior in super diverse contexts, the term of choice in language, and of course, super diversity. And of course, it captures, according to Garcia and Lee Wei, new language practices that make visible the complexity of language exchanges. So what is translanguaging and not code switching? Well, translanguaging, according to Garcia and Lee Wei, does not refer to two separate languages. Let's keep that in mind. And Peter made a very compelling argument just a few minutes ago that no, we are talking about separate language, even from their own data set of Gabriela and the recognition that this is Spanish and that is English, or as Garcia and Lee Wei would say, well, some call it English or something like that, tongue in cheek. Nor to a synthesis of different language practices or to hybrid mixture. Rather, translanguaging refers to new language practices that make visible, again, the complexity and the different histories and so on. And translanguaging also differs from the notion of code switching, they argue, is in that it refers not simply to a shift or shuttle between two languages, but to speakers' construction use of original complex interrelated discursive practices. And this was discussed earlier too. So it is a process of making meaning, shaping experiences, gaining understanding and knowledge through the use of two languages. Again, even for Baker, who is also one of those earlier exponents of translanguage, they are talking about languages, they are talking about discreteness, although that's a paper that we have sent elsewhere to talk about the discreteness of languages in bilingual language use. Now, Kreese and Blackledge are talking about this one instance in the school situation, and this teacher is talking to an audience, and she's talking about the after-school issues. What's going to happen here? Jalram Balva Kasama, holiday Nati Avati Shabinare Apne Avanuche, goes on and on about Gujarati and English. And I'm assuming you know Gujarati very well. And of course, some of you may know English too, at least this Indian English. So there is this switch between English and the Gujarati. Now, the phrases that are spoken in English, they are given to you. You can take a quick look at it. And the phrase spoken in Gujarati, with, of course, English translations are over on the other side. What you see is something very nondescript, but the claim that they make is very interesting. Again, these are the proponents of translanguaging, I believe what Jeff would call these early translanguagers. Now, she said, Kreese and Blackledge, they argue that both languages are needed simultaneously to convey the information. These are direct quotes, by the way. All right, then each language is used to convey a different informational message. I mean, again, you try to see, that is why I tried to show that there were these phrases that were spoken in English and phrases that were spoken in Gujarati. And it's not, I mean, if you look at some, even with any informational theoretic system, what were the real logical differences between the informational packaging? There wasn't any. But the argument was not presented. It was just that the claim was stated. Each language is used to convey a different informational message. Again, it was asserted, not supported by any evidence. So what is the different informational message, in other words, conveyed by Gujarati that is not conveyed by the use of English, or vice versa? And in their work, and if you go through clearly the paper, the abstract one on page 108 and 109, it does not support, nothing supports the claim. There's nothing in the discussion or in the empirical evidence, which I'm familiar with. I know a fair bit of Gujarati, but certainly English too. And when you look at the data, there is really something that is something entirely different going on. Again, very interesting, but not what they're saying. Okay. But then they argue that, which is very interesting, and I would like you to pay attention. This is again a direct quote. It is in the movement between languages that SB is the teacher, the speaker of that long quote, engages with her diverse audience. Her languages do not appear separate for her. Again, this is the sloppiness that sometimes you notice in academic writing. Where is the evidence that's not discussed? That there is a movement between languages, although then the claim is made. So there is the discrete notion of language that is later being, reinterpreted as this undifferentiated features that occupy your verbal repertoire. And magically, we basically pull these features as bilingual, multilingual speakers and construct our message, whatever the intention is. So from the intention, from the mind to the mouth, what comes out is something magical that there's no explanation for that. So it is in the movement between languages that this teacher engages with her diverse audience. Her, again, languages, this is exactly the direct quote, do not appear separate for her in the social act, but rather as a resource to negotiate meanings and include as much of the audience as possible. Again, I already talked about that. The problem really is that the speaker is claimed to move between languages. So in other words, there is this movement between languages. The switch between English and Gujarati is evidence of that, as an act of linguistic accommodation. If you reinterpret what they're saying, clearly we are aware of audience design and so on and so forth. But then they claim, again, without any ethnographic evidence or proof, that the speaker appears not to have the languages separated as she is accommodating to, in the act of accommodating to and signaling identity alignments with parents, students, and teachers with varying proficiency of Gujarati and English. I mean, and in the paper, they do mention that, there are parents in this meeting, there are students in the meeting, and there are, of course, the teachers. And of course, there are these variable competence in both of those languages. So she's well, as a sociolinguist, that's what you read. Now, this is what is interesting, that those who are claiming, and Peter also brought it up, Jeff started out as he was contextualizing the talks here, that the idea of discreteness that is being challenged, that, Pennycook saying, oh, well, we need to just get rid of everything and so on and so forth, rather misguided, as Peter was arguing. So, and again, they themselves acknowledge language, but then because of this theoretical ideology that they follow seems to forbid them to claim what is clearly in your face, and that's very interesting. Now, I want to talk about code switching because I think Peter also highlighted this idea that it's not ever been the case that it was named languages or switch between named languages. Here is Erica Brett work in 2009. It's really the piece that I'm going to, this over here is Travis Smiley. It's from Travis Smiley's show. This is a PBS show, used to be, I don't think it's on the air anymore. And Travis Smiley used to have his audience. There were a lot of times there were Black audiences, and now it isn't PBS, so the language was always the standard language because the demographics of these PBS shows are generally 25 to 105, I think, mainly educated folks, mainly middle class and above. So there he is interviewing Pam Grier, who had been in this very popular show, but in the Black community, unpopular show called The L Word. And she was basically, the community was not happy that she was, portraying lesbianism or what have you. And in his discussion, Smiley basically is now, as he's interviewing, coming to a point where he wants to talk about, how the community's response to her playing this gay woman is not really accepted. And the way he starts talking about is, he says to Ben Greer, as well as I do, that gayness, homosexuality, lesbianism, still very much a taboo subject, not as much as it used to be, but still very much a taboo subject inside of Black America, specifically, Smiley goes again, and Black folk love Pam Grier. Everybody loves Pam Grier, but Black folk especially love Pam Grier. Now, what do you say to Black folk who say, now, Pam Grier, you done got caught up in it. Now you done gone too far. Now, this is a very interesting switch from standard to the African-American English. And what does it do? Something really remarkably, incredibly interesting, that as Tavis Smiley switches his voice of the interviewer voice to the voice of the community, the authors who of this oppositional stance that we don't like this portrayal, he is able to distance himself from the folks in the Black community who are unhappy with Pam Grier's lesbian portrayal in this, the L Word. This was a TV show. And yet at the same time, he's able to claim this symbolic ethnic solidarity with her by appealing to this shared knowledge of the African-American English community. So mitigating the potentially face-threatening act, because he is basically accusing. So it does a lot of work, functional, social, indexical work for him, just where he switches. Now, this is what keeps us sociolinguists who are interested in bilingualism awake in the night, that why switches. It's very difficult to understand or to interpret, but you need to have the theoretical and the logical force to interpret the data in ways that makes the story coherent. And in this case, as Erica Britt herself, an African-American woman, and finishing a doctorate here at the University of Illinois, she was working at it, and she basically came up with these conclusions. And I think they are, so this is the kind of bilingual creativity that Raj Kachu and others were also talking about. How we use our linguistic resources in ways that maximize our intentions, and at the same time keeps the conversation in these safe zones, or not create a faux pas, and all kinds of things that we have talked about. The politeness regulations, how those politeness conventions get into the play, how we always, either polite and indirect speech and so on and so forth. Code switching does the same, the kind of things that John Gumpers were talking about in contextualization cues. What are those? Well, code switching was one of them. And this is what you find here in this small little excerpt. Now, Leeway, in a later article that appeared in Applied Linguistics, talked about, why in his translanguaging theory, or I forget the title of the paper, and he talks about in everyday social interaction, language users move dynamically between the so-called languages, language varieties, and again, styled registers and writing systems to fulfill a variety of strategic and communicative functions. The alternation between languages, his quote, spoken, written, or signed, between language varieties, and between speech, writing, and signing is a very common feature of human interaction. So far, so good. And then he says,
Dr. Bhatt, we are over 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll just stop right now. So again, I want to just give you the understanding that we are in a academic world where we ought to inspect our terms and the theoretical constructs we offer to understand the object of a linguistic inquiry, in this case, bilingual language use. And I think that what I have tried to do is to show that there are plenty of other so I'll stop here, and I feel that I have made the argument that I think code switching was just doing fine. It didn't have to be pushed away by these new constructs that don't offer anything new. I'll stop now.
Thank you so much. And we have our final presentation is Stephen May, and I'll do the slide share for this one as well.
Kia ora tātou katoa. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Peter said it was 9 p.m. I think in Europe. It's 9 a.m. in New Zealand the following morning. So it's good to be able to cross time zones and be with you this, well, my morning, your afternoon, most of you. Thank you for coming. I want to begin this short presentation by reiterating, along with all of my colleagues, my absolute commitment to an advocacy for bilingualism, multilingualism, and related approaches to education that value those. And I'm also committed and remain committed to what I termed in my 24 edited collection, the multilingual turn, to that concept. As I noted back then, and as I still believe, this multilingual turn, along with related developments in sociolinguistic superdiversity, ratiolinguistics, and in translanguaging, of course, which is the focus of this seminar, have been especially welcome, not to mention long overdue in both applied linguistics and sociolinguistics. And of course, even SLA has started to come to the party, albeit belatedly, particularly through the work of the Douglas Fir Group and their pivotal contributions in the Modern Language Journal in 2016 and 2019. But I also at the time raised some cautions about these developments. The first related to their demonstrable lack of historicity. Urban multilingualism, the focus of much of this new work, particularly superdiversity, is not solely the product of late modernity, as many of its advocates presume. It's been present in earlier periods of history, particularly prior to the advent of nationalism and the nation state. And of course, it's also complex multilingualism, at least, has been a factor for many centuries in terms of Indigenous peoples and their interactions with colonizers. And so relatedly, the sudden discovery of the merits of multilingualism by Western sociolinguists and applied linguists clearly reveals its own ethnocentrism. After all, scholars from beyond the West have long argued for the merits of bilingualism and multilingualism, albeit more broadly than just in urban contexts. And they've also contested monolingual norms that still underpin the study of language teaching and learning. So broadly speaking, these two concerns that I raised even at the start of this discussion a few years back still hold for me in relation to what we have come to see since. And this is particularly evident in my view with respect to the increasingly trenchant and dichotomous construction of what we've termed this deconstructivist view of translanguaging as a new distinctive, and it seems increasingly inviolate, pedagogical orthodoxy. So in the time I have left, and Liv, if you just turn straight to the first of my concerns, which I think is 2 slides ahead of you now, and then through the next slide, and then that following slide. So in the time I have left, I just want to highlight briefly, very briefly, 5 key concerns that I think need to be addressed in relation to these developments. The first, and I address these concerns because of my concern of, it seems to be almost already the risk of what I term paradigmatic closure. So the first concern, if you just click on it, Leave, it should come up, thank you, is to do with new paradigms, antinomies, and the rush to recency, something that some of the others have already addressed. Because it seems that inevitably in any new theoretical paradigm, in establishing this, it involves the repudiation of established ones, emphasizing how different, revolutionary this new paradigm is. And in the process, we often find a high degree of historical amnesia, as Peter and Rakesh and others have already talked about, or at least historical ellipsis. So this synchronic rather than diachronic view of the field, and what I term here the related rush to recency, leads us to unnecessarily dispense with and or simply ignore older paradigms, along with what they might still be able to contribute to current or new understandings. And the repudiation of previous frameworks is most evident in the establishment of antinomies between the key concepts or nomenclature of the new versus the old or older paradigms. Code switching and translanguaging have already been dealt with at some length in this presentation. So I'll just give one other brief example of this in relation to recent developments in more deconstructivist accounts of translanguaging. And that's the contradistinction between additive bilingualism, which has for 60 years underpinned critical bilingual educational practices, and dynamic bilingualism, the preferred term of translanguaging advocates. And what we see there is that additive bilingualism has since come to be dismissed out of hand as a monoglossic and inherently racialized conception of bilingualism, as reinforcing the idea of distinct languages, as we've been discussing, and by extension, or so the story goes, of adopting a two solitudes or dual language or dual competence approach to educational instruction. So, for example, Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa claim that additive approaches to bilingual education continue to interpret the linguistic practices of bilinguals through a monolingual framework that marginalizes the fluid linguistic practices of their communities. But as Cummins has argued, and none of these critiques of additive bilingualism necessarily entails in relation to it, because he argues that additive bilingualism, this is in his recent Harvard Educational Review article in 2017, can still be consistent with a heteroglossic view of bilingualism. And I have similarly argued that a focus on dynamic bilingualism should be seen as complementary to, rather than as superseding, additive bilingualism, although I admit that the term additive does suggest accretion. And this is because, though, nonetheless, in my view, dynamic bilingualism highlights rightly the complexity and fluidity of bilingualism, while additive bilingualism encompasses a broader socio-political dimension and aim in revaluing bilingualism as an educational and wider social norm, rather than, as in still dominant subtractive conceptions, as anomalous and or aberrant. So that's my first concern. My second concern, next slide, thanks, Lee, is around the notion of what I term methodological nationalism and the problem of generalizability. If you just click again, it should come up for the text. Thank you. So this rejection to court of long-standing and still potentially complementary theoretical understandings of bi and multilingualism is understandable in terms of the construction and related impermeability of new academic paradigms. However, rejecting or dichotomizing potentially complementary understandings actually undermines the claims to transdisciplinarity that are increasingly made on behalf of translanguaging. And in this regard, I just want to focus on the second concern around the fact that translanguaging reflects, it seems to me, a sometimes hidden methodological nationalism. Now, methodological nationalism, particularly in the work of Wimmer and Glick-Sheilah, refers to the widespread naturalization of the nation state as equivalent, in effect, to society within the social sciences. And more specifically, in relation to this discussion, methodological nationalism reflects and reinforces the identification that many scholars maintain with their own nation states. And so Wimmer and Glick-Sheilah say we need to think outside the box of dominant national discourses. And I raise this because although advocates of translanguaging are quick to acknowledge that the term initially came from Ken Williams in Wales and in relation to Welsh medium education, nonetheless, the locus of its subsequent advocacy and expansion has clearly been the United States, particularly, although not exclusively, in relation to Latinx education, and predominantly, as with superdiversity, with respect to urban contexts. So this in turn underpins advocacy for translanguaging as a pedagogical strategy, and relatedly, the dismissal of a separate, or as it's termed, negatively siloed approach to languages of instruction and bi or multilingual education. And what I want to suggest here very briefly is that while Spanish is clearly a minoritized, marginalized language in the US, it's nonetheless still widely spoken in the general population. And this is demonstrably not the case, as Terry and Sheilah have already argued in relation to Indigenous language contexts. So just taking my own context of Aotearoa New Zealand, in Māori medium education here, we still focus on separation of languages of instruction because otherwise English encroaches everywhere if it doesn't, if Māori is not prioritized within Māori medium education, where can it be? And so separation of instruction is seen still as the best means of retaining some sense of linguistic autonomy for Indigenous languages in the classroom, for, if not there, where. So in short, while there has been a clear internationalism of translanguaging research, particularly over the last few years, the origins of its dominating national context, the US, and by extension, its generalizability, it seems to me, remain moot. So my third concern, next slide, thanks, Leave, is around the tension between the deconstruction of languages and achieving biliteracy, because a key tenet of the deconstructivist position on translanguaging and the multilingual turn and superdiversity more broadly, as we've seen, is that no distinct language varieties exist to begin with. But this is also allied increasingly, and we see this in ratiolinguistics particularly, with the pathologizing of standardized language varieties, which are seen as misrepresenting and delimiting the far more complex, fluid and dynamic oral multilingual repertoires of students. And Vivian Cook's excellent chapter in the volume talks about this directly. I'm conscious of time, so I just want to briefly address this issue and then move to my final two observations. I've recently argued that the fetishizing of individual multilingual repertoires and the dismissal of academic language registers simply entrenches rather than ameliorates educational disadvantage for the already marginalized. We see this in Indigenous context, for example, where, as has already been referred to by Sheilah and Terry, Indigenous languages are simply dismissed as colonial constructs, and therefore, by extension, many of these same authors dismiss Indigenous language education as a means of language reclamation. But that seems to me to be particularly problematic for the reasons that have already been canvassed by Terry and Sheilah. And also, as Jeff mentioned, in relation to the recognition of idealized, ultimately speech communities such as African American English. So the dismissal of academic language registers, I think, actually undermines many of the social justice claims that attend to translanguaging, because, of course, a key tenet of successful bilingual, multilingual education is biliteracy, multiliteracy in the classroom, as we know from decades of educational research. And so in order to achieve those levels of biliteracy, we need to engage with standardized language registers alongside our fluid multilingual oral repertoires. So my second to last point, my penultimate concern then relates to a similar point, that the fetishizing of individual linguistic repertoires, it seems to me, overstates individual agency. So it's seen as intrinsically transgressive in and of itself. But if individuals are still constrained by structural factors that delimit or devalue or dismiss or pathologize their language varieties, then whatever we do individually is not really transgressive in terms of changing those structures. Again, a point that Jeff alluded to in relation to Peter McLaren's critique of postmodernism early on. So in this sense, the focus on individual polyglot repertoires or mobile linguistic resources does not yet tell us as much as it might, or indeed should, about how we might actually harness these repertoires more effectively with respect to wider educational and social mobility. And so my last point that I want to raise, just in closing, is that I have not seen, and I may have simply missed it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to me that there has been no addressing directly or any sense of critical reflexivity of our own elite bi or multilingual linguistic repertoires in relation to these discussions. Sorry, that's my own alarm going off. So I just want to raise that as a point which we might want to discuss further, but in deconstructivist accounts of translanguaging, at least that I've seen, our own positionality as speakers, readers and writers with access to elite high value standardized language registers is not something that we discuss. And that seems to me to be a key lacuna in terms of some of the arguments that dismiss the value of language registers. So I'm conscious I've run out of time, so I'll leave it at that. But thank you again for the opportunity to speak about these issues. Just one final point perhaps is that I raise these concerns because there are claims increasingly of translanguaging being a transdisciplinary space. And my concern is that in this rush to create a new orthodoxy, what we get in contrast is a closing down of those academic spaces, an ossification already seems early on, rather than opening up to a transdisciplinary engagement that engages with allied conceptions rather than simply rejecting them. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters, and I'm aware of the time, and nonetheless like to open it up for a couple of minutes of question and answer, moderated by Laura Hamano Ortiz and Cristina De Nicolo.
Thanks so much, Leave. So I'll jump right in with one question. We did open up the Q&A to presenters when they registered for the webinar, and so we had a lot of questions that came in, specifically looking at pedagogical implications of this approach. And so kind of synthesizing some of those questions. One question that we had was, what do you see as the differences between a pedagogy of translanguaging emerging from this multilingual perspective versus one that would be emerging from a deconstructivist stance? Or perhaps what are the affordances of this multilingual perspective on a pedagogy of translanguaging? So if anyone wants to speak to the pedagogical implications.
I can go, and then of course any other panelists who might like to add are welcome to do so. So one of my points was to differentiate between sort of translanguaging pedagogy and translanguaging theory. And I think when you turn to pedagogy, things look pretty similar across. So for example, Chris Foltis and Roman Jacobson did some terrific work on pedagogical code switching back in the 90s. And people have continued to use code switching as a construct and concept in research on bilingual teaching and learning. And so I think, some of the work, Chris Foltis and I did an edited volume in 2020 called Code Switching in the Classroom. And there's quite a lot of work in there where people talk about the utility of code switching as a pedagogical construct. And they contrast it with translanguaging, not always in a critical way, but they say, it's hard to talk about a translanguaging. It's easy to talk about a code switch. And so as sort of an analytic term, people found it much more useful. The theoretical distinction, I think, is at issue in the book that we're representing here. And I think it has more consequences, really practical consequences for issues in language policy, and relatively few practical consequences, in my opinion, for pedagogy. I think those pedagogical questions, regardless of how people characterize them theoretically, sort of remain the same at a practical level. Stephen, I think you've thought about these things a bit.
Yeah, I suppose I would differ slightly. I think certainly in terms of my own context, what we're seeing is a sort of recognition on the one hand of translanguaging as obviously a feature that is at least in our context broadly comparable to code switching, and so it's acknowledged within Māori medium classrooms, for example, but we still have a pedagogical preference for some degree of separation of languages of instruction for those wider socio-political and socio-linguistic reasons. So there is perhaps a degree of reticence around following a full translanguaging pedagogical route, particularly in relation to Indigenous language revitalization contexts.
Right, and just to make a note, I think that's a very important point. So, sort of thinking of translanguaging as a policy about classroom practice, I think it is important to be cautious about, how we structure translanguaging activity. I think that's Stephen's point. And so the chapter in the book by Mapake and Kedek, which is about Gaelic language revitalization efforts through immersion schools, makes this point strongly and says, when you're in a context where you're trying to revitalize a language and English is, pushing everybody because of its social status, you really do need to have conditions of separation.
So do we have time for one additional question? I actually think Peter had noted he was going to answer one question live.
I think so. If go ahead, I would say.
Okay, Peter, do you want to go ahead? And then I'm going to ask one more from so much great engagement. I'm just loving all the questions being posted in the chat. Thank you.
Was there a question directly asked for me?
Oh, I noted that you were going to answer. There was one question. If not translanguaging, how would you interpret code switching used by L2 speaker instead of lack of proficiency? It was written down. Peter Auer is going to answer this question live.
Well, I think there is lots of ways of conceptualizing code switching that have nothing to do with lack of competence. My main argument has always been that it's exactly not that. It's not about a lack of competence, but it's about functional juxtaposition of two codes. So you do it because you want to achieve something, selecting a different argument, a different co-participant as the addressee, making a joke instead of being serious, all that stuff. That's what people do with code switching all the time. So it's not intimately linked to deficiency in L2. It can be, of course, but that's not the main function of code switching.
Thank you. And then I'm going to raise one question I feel like wasn't addressed as much. Scholars advocating for translanguaging researchers also take race into consideration while discussing language practices in bilingual contexts. How do code switching scholars view this issue?
Stephen, I think that came up quite a bit in your talk, the idea of language and race. I don't know if others want to speak to that. What I would say is that there is and has been widespread interest in sociolinguistics around issues of race. Samuel Leem, John Rickford, and Arthena Ball wrote a beautiful edited book called Raciolinguistics, where they actually, introduced this term, raciolinguistics, and talked about it as the intersection of race and language studies. And there are a lot of really interesting things to say about it. John Baugh's work that I alluded to in my presentation looks at language as a proxy for race and as an instrument of facilitation for racism. And so there are definite intersections between language and race that we should talk about. But I don't think there's a code switching view of this. And there may not really be a translanguaging view of this, but rather I would see it as an important topic that scholars across a wide range of inquiry might want to engage.
Sheilah and Terry might want to respond to this, but just, obviously, in relation to Indigenous language contexts and decoloniality, race has always been a feature of this. So I absolutely endorse, as I mentioned, the rise of the theoretical paradigm of racial linguistics, although I think in relation to Indigenous language contexts and colonial contexts, we have long struggled with this idea, and indeed the flag behind me is a decolonial construct of the New Zealand flag. So, it's something that is always prominent in terms of the violence that's been attendant on colonisation of Indigenous peoples, and in terms of the positioning of their Indigenous languages.
I'd like to make a quick comment. When Jeff was talking about John Baugh's work, that takes into consideration that there are two distinct varieties, and he does it rather very efficiently, calling people up and asking for whether this apartment was for rent in standard English and then in African-American English, and he gets two different responses. This is a study that he has been following since the late 80s, linguistic profiling and so on. That was part of the entire paradigm that has now been recast in racial linguistics. But what is interesting, and which is contrary to what the translanguaging folks are saying, that there was a clear distinction and recognition and acknowledgement, a tacit acknowledgement of the idea that even these two varieties were contrasted at some conceptual level, so that when he would speak in standard English, well, the apartment became suddenly available. When he didn't, and he used African-American English, then it was not available. Or when he would use standard English and then go to the apartment person, they would say, oh, well, you know, this apartment is already rented, because he was this African-American person, you know, showing up when they thought it was, you know, some white person. So, and he talks about what is now called racial linguistics, but he talks about language race. Though Jeff was talking about racial profiling. So I don't think it is a translanguaging issue or a code switching issue. It is at least a code switching issue where there's a recognition of these two distinct varieties that reside in the minds of these multilingual or bilingual, bidialectal speakers. So I think it is an argument for actually talking about code switching as we have been in this webinar.
Go ahead, Christina.
Oh, I was gonna ask one clarification question. If we, is the recording going to be sent to everyone who registered?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so there was a couple questions about that, and I think Laura, do we have time for one more question? Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, if we have time for one more, I just thought maybe a good concluding question might be, I'm looking at a question posed by Cam Smith that's kind of going back, I think, Rakesh, to your question about kind of what is the value of translanguaging? Do we need translanguaging? I'm kind of asking maybe about some of the risks and concerns that have been levied at translanguaging that might also be, that the construct of code switching might also be faced with. So I'm just curious, and I imagine you have different perspectives on this across the panel, but the book is still using translanguaging as the lens, but moving towards a multilingual perspective on translanguaging. Where do you land between, do we need this? Is translanguaging moving us forward in a direction that we should be moving as a field? Is translanguaging good enough and we should just return back? Where do folks fall on that?
I can give you a very short answer. No, we're not moving forward with that.
I think I would say that translanguaging, as Ofelia Garcia portrayed it in her 2009 book, was an exciting idea because it kind of revitalized the field at a time when it really needed around issues of bilingual teaching and learning, because we had faced so much political oppression against multilingualism in many states. And so work on bilingual teaching, which was cast as code switching, and kind of, I think, waned off. And so it was great and kind of reinvigorated research in that area. But I think, as Stephen pointed out in his talk, there was too quick a move toward orthodoxy. And so you find people are very reluctant to, as a journal editor, I'm really shocked often at how people will say things like, well, the translanguaging view is, well, this is not a religion. We don't say the Christian view is, the Catholic view is. We say research suggests, this evidence indicates, And so I think there's a tendency toward orthodoxy within this spectrum of work that is very concerning, as Stephen pointed out very powerfully. And I think that what a lot of code switching researchers find very aggravating, and I know I speak for Peter and Rakesh here, is, I love Stephen's phrase on this, his historical amnesia with regard to research. So, you critique a vast 100-year-old body of work that is extremely extensive by simply ignoring it and inventing a characterization of that body of work. I think anybody as a scholar could relate to how frustrating it would be to have to read and respond to work like that. And that is the nature of the translanguaging critique of code switching. And so it's very frustrating. And so I think if we were to start with a sociolinguistic engagement with the code switching literature, we would have arrived at a very different point, a very different set of conclusions. So for example, somebody else asked in the Q&A, well, is there kind of a middle ground between these two views? Well, in a sense there is, but it's a middle ground between an invented point of view, it's, so there, in my work, I've outlined sort of three perspectives on bilingual diversity in terms of individual grammar, and pointed out that, there's sort of the Unitarian view, which is the deconstructivist view, and there's this invented view that nobody believes of dual competence, that there's complete language separation at a cognitive level. And then there's the view that emerges from code switching scholarship, which is, this integrated multilingual approach. And that is, there are shared grammatical and cognitive resources underlying our bilingual language. But because languages have contradictory requirements, some languages put adjectives after nouns, some put them before nouns, the list goes on. These pockets of distinction have to be represented in a way that is discrete. And people have talked about this through a variety of ways throughout the history of sociolinguistics. John Gumpers called them subsystems. Other people, Vivian Cook referred to a super system. So, this is a common core. And so I think if we want to think about bilingual, I think the correct way to think about our linguistic diversity is in terms of an integrated system. So it's not sort of one way or the other. And so maybe that can come to people as a sort of, common ground that they might appreciate.
Thank you so much. I want to conclude this webinar by really thanking the panelists and for not only their appearance here, but the hard work that they put into their volume. And I look forward to having additional discussions around those conversations. It was really rewarding. I also want to thank the co-moderators, Laura, Christina, Marisol, for helping and with the facilitating the question and answers, which I'm still going through right now. And please don't hesitate to reach out to me personally if you have questions or for future or ways in which you'd like to be involved in the special interest group. Or if you don't receive a link to the webinar and are curious to know where to find it, please reach out to me. And with that, I think I'd like to wish you all the best. Good morning, have a good day, have a good evening, and have a good afternoon. And thank you once again to Jeff and colleagues for your amazing work.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
I'm surprised that people stayed as long as they did. That's amazing.
That's true.
Thank
you,
See you
Steve,
all.
and everybody. Bye-bye.
Good
See you
rest of
around
the day.
the campus.
Yes, I hope so. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Sergio?
Yes, I'm going to go ahead and end it.
Sure, we can end it. Thank you so much for your help too.
Of course. I'll send you the recording via the box folder you created.
Perfect. All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye.